For decades, Prince Edward was the quietest royal, rarely stepping out of line or stirring headlines. But now, after years of silence, he's dropped a bombshell no one expected, an emotional confession that pierces through the palace's carefully crafted facade. What he's about to reveal about Charles and Anne's early lives could rewrite the monarchy's legacy forever. This isn't gossip, it's a royal reckoning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. He sat across from the interviewer with an expression that trembled between defiance and dread. His voice, usually composed and measured, wavered as he began. It haunted them both, but no one dared speak, he confessed, eyes fixed on a memory clearly still vivid. It wasn't just a passing remark, it was a crack in the foundation of decades of royal silence. The interviewer paused, stunned. Edward didn't flinch. He had come to tell the truth, and there would be no going back. Those 8 words reverberated through the room, unleashing a flood of speculation. Suddenly, the quietest of the Queen's children had become the loudest echo of a truth, long buried beneath ceremony and tradition. Within hours, palace insiders began whispering behind closed doors. The revelation wasn't met with surprise, but rather a chilling acknowledgement. He finally said it, one aide reportedly muttered under their breath. It wasn't just what Edward had said, but how it instantly sliced through the decades of careful image crafting the crown had relied on. Staff, who had served through multiple generations, now looked over their shoulders, some nodding grimly, others retreating into silence. Edward hadn't just broken a silence, he had broken a code. The implications were explosive, threatening to unravel a controlled narrative forged through years of obedience and denial. But why now? What finally pushed Edward to speak? Those closest to him claimed it had been building for years. Subtle changes in his demeanor, private frustrations at family gatherings, moments when he almost said too much until now he had held it all in. A recent discovery, reportedly made after Queen Elizabeth's passing, may have been the final spark. Edward had always been protective of his siblings, especially Anne, but something had shifted. Something had made him believe the truth was no longer a threat to the crown, but a necessity for its survival. The truth, he believed, would no longer destroy them. Silence would. What makes his words even more haunting is the glimpse they offer into an early royal childhood, wrapped not in warmth, but in ritual, distance, and whispered warnings. The image of Charles and Anne playing in palace courtyards or walking behind their parents on state visits was only half the truth. The other half was hidden behind closed doors, where cold hallways echoed with cries quickly silenced, and where emotion was treated as a threat to duty. Edward, too young to understand at the time, had begun to piece it all together as he grew older. "I never understood why Anne would flinch when someone knocked," he once recalled. "Now, I know." But the most chilling part of Edward's confession came near the end of the interview, when he looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but steady. Even the Queen, he said, couldn't stop what happened. The weight of those words hung in the air, triggering a silence deeper than any royal protocol could command. If the monarch herself was powerless, then who held the reins? But what exactly did Charles and Anne endure behind the palace walls? The answer lies in the shadowy halls of their early years, where duty clashed with danger. Inside the palaces of gold and grandeur, 2 royal children carried a weight far heavier than crowns. Charles and Anne weren't just heirs, they were pawns in a ruthless game of image, legacy, and silence. What no one outside those gates knew was the unspoken trauma that shaped them and nearly broke them. The world saw a polished royal fairy tale, but behind the velvet curtains was a truth wrapped in frost. Charles and Anne were raised in an environment where affection was rationed, not freely given. Emotions were treated as weakness, warmth as a threat to duty. They were expected to stand straight, speak softly, and never question the cold echo of their upbringing. While the cameras captured fleeting smiles and practiced waves, their days were governed by schedules, more fitting for soldiers than children. Inside those palace walls, protocol smothered tenderness. The Queen and Prince Philip were often absent, sometimes for months. Official tours were cited as the reason, but their absences weren't always explained. And even when they were physically present, they were emotionally distant. Charles, often left under the stern gaze of Pallas, Nanny's, was reportedly prone to sudden crying spells. Anne, more stoic, would retreat into long silences. Neither dared speak of the unease that settled in their chests, not even to each other. Over time, their bond began to fracture, not out of resentment, but survival. Staff members recall strange moments, whispers of locked nursery doors, aides abruptly dismissed without notice. A new governess would arrive, and just as quickly vanish. One even left in the middle of the night. No farewells, no reason, just gone. One footman claimed he heard a child scream during an evening shift but was told it was nothing of concern. Still, the palace halls grew quieter. Not in peace, but in suppression. Something was happening behind those locked doors, and no one, not even the Queen, it seemed, would confront it. There was one wing of the nursery strictly off limits. Even Edward, born later, was never permitted to enter. He once asked why that part of the corridor was always sealed, only to be told it was under refurbishment, a claim repeated for years without any sign of change. Rumours swirled among senior staff, but silence was enforced with veiled threats. Loyalty to the crown meant looking away, but perhaps the most chilling clue came years later, in the form of a letter buried deep in the Queen Mother's personal collection. The tone was urgent, nearly panicked. She referenced the growing shadow inside Windsor and warned of a presence tolerated too long. What did she mean by that? Who or what was she referring to? The note was unsigned, save for her initials and a cryptic line, "The children must not be alone with her again," but the darkest suspicions didn't come from outsiders, they were felt within. And one mysterious figure stood at the centre of it all. She was known as Miss Harrow, a figure of discipline, elegance, and discretion. But behind the polished smile hid a past wrapped in deception. According to Edward's testimony, this woman left emotional scars that still shaped Charles and Anne's every decision. Who was she really, and why did the palace erase her so thoroughly? To the outside world, Miss Harrow was the perfect governess, poised, articulate, and devoted to the royal children. But Edward's chilling admission changed everything. She was the linchpin, he said quietly. It all began and ended with her. His voice didn't tremble with anger, it cracked under the weight of what he remembered. Not as a direct victim, but as the silent witness who slowly pieced together the damage years later. According to him, the palace didn't remove her because she failed, but because she succeeded in doing something they could no longer defend. A royal experiment cloaked in maternal care, a facade of mentorship hiding methodical control. Among palace staff, the whispers were divided. Some described Harrow as a nurturing force who taught Charles to read and Anne to ride. Others refused to even utter her name. One long-retired butler, speaking under anonymity, claimed she ran the nursery like a secretive regime. Children weren't comforted, they were calibrated. Staff who questioned her methods were quietly dismissed. One nanny who lasted less than a week reportedly said, "The children aren't learning, they're being rewired." And that phrase lingered, ominous and unanswered. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A fragment of Charles's childhood journal, hidden within an old travel trunk, revealed strange drawings and notes about something called the mirror room. The pages were riddled with phrases like, "Don't blink too long," and "She counts in whispers." Anne's section, by contrast, was blank, eerily blank. But it was a public outburst years later that raised alarms. During a heated moment with a reporter, Anne hissed, "Kindness is a weakness, just ask Harrow." The name sent shockwaves through those who remembered. Behind palace doors, an old intelligence file surfaced, heavily redacted and marked with MI5's emblem. It referenced a civilian consultant with psychological conditioning experience, embedded for the strategic benefit of legacy reinforcement. The codename, Hawkeye, cross-referencing dates and deployment, aligned perfectly with Miss Harrow's tenure. If true, this wasn't childcare, it was behavioral engineering, and the monarchy allowed it, perhaps even encouraged it. Edward's face during the interview said what the Crown never would. This wasn't an act of ignorance, it was intentional oversight. She didn't just teach them, he whispered. She shaped them into something they were never meant to be. That sentence alone revealed the depths of betrayal. Charles and Anne weren't molded by fate, they were manipulated by design. And Harrow wasn't just a ghost from the past. She was the architect of a future built on pain, silence, and obedience. But this wasn't just a case of one woman. It was part of a calculated palace experiment in control. And the next chapter is even more disturbing. It sounds like a script from a thriller, a covert palace operation designed to mold young royals into obedient monarchs. But Prince Edward claims Operation Obedience was very real, and Charles and Anne were its first victims. If true, this is more than manipulation. It's state-sanctioned trauma. According to Edward, the program wasn't named out loud in the halls of Buckingham. It didn't need to be. The signs were hidden in routine, masked as tradition, and justified under the banner of duty. But buried deep in royal archives, Edward claims, are coded references to a psychological conditioning strategy known only by its initials OO, short for Operation Obedience. The initiative, he alleges, was designed not to protect the monarchy, but to sculpt its heirs into unwavering, emotionally subdued symbols of power. Charles and Anne weren't just raised, they were programmed. Internal palace memos, dated as early as 1959, refer cryptically to Phase Y implementation protocols and developmental rigidity markers. What makes these memos even more disturbing is that they coincide precisely with Charles's abrupt removal from familiar routines and his extended stays at Balmoral away from Anne, away from familiar staff, and under the strict supervision of a new psychological advisor. Edward claims these so-called advisors weren't mental health experts in the traditional sense. They were specialists in behavioral reshaping tasked with erasing fear, suppressing autonomy, and instilling absolute control. Charles's recurring childhood nightmares, often dismissed as symptoms of stress, began shortly after one such retreat to Balmoral. He would reportedly wake drenched in sweat, whispering phrases no one understood. "She's still watching," he once muttered to a footman. Another time, "Don't let her count to 10. These weren't just night terrors. They were embedded responses to something deeper, something orchestrated. And then there were the tapes. Security surveillance from inside palace nurseries was once routine, meant to monitor for threats, or so it was said. But according to Edward, most of these recordings were mysteriously destroyed in the 1970s, under the directive of a now-deceased senior aide. One, however, survived hidden away in a private safe and only discovered after the Queen's passing. Though the content remains classified, Edward says he watched enough to know they weren't being protected. They were being tested. A former royal aide, whose identity remains concealed for security reasons, provided a damning statement through legal intermediaries. The goal, he said, was to remove the unpredictable, make them polished, precise, programmable. He continued, they were being reshaped, not for who they were, but for what the crown needed them to be. Chilling words that echo through the chambers of tradition, duty, and repression. Anne, always considered the tougher, more resilient sibling, eventually began pushing back. Her adolescent defiance, the abrupt refusals to attend engagements, her cold shoulder toward senior officials was never random. Seen through this new lens, it was retaliation. It was survival. Her rebellion wasn't about image. It was about reclaiming the fragments of a stolen childhood. And though she never named the program, those closest to her say she always knew she had been changed without her consent, and just when it seemed nothing could be more shocking, Edward revealed the moment everything cracked, the forbidden night that shattered Charles and Anne's childhood bond. One night, one door left unlocked, one scream that still echoes through the minds of those who heard it. Prince Edward claims this night in Windsor was the turning point, the moment Charles and Anne ceased being children and became survivors. But what truly unfolded in that corridor? The silence that followed was almost louder than the scream itself. Edward remembers the chill of being jolted awake not by noise, but by a strange stillness that had crept into the castle's air. Moments later, a voice pierced the night. It was Charles. "It's done, she knows." That's all Edward heard. But it was enough to freeze him. He was just a child, too young to understand, yet instinctively aware that something irreversible had just occurred. In the hours that followed, chaos didn't erupt. Instead, it was buried, hidden beneath royal protocol and a silence too heavy to be natural. Within 48 hours, a senior royal security officer, one who had guarded the nursery for years, was reassigned without notice. No farewell, no replacement announced. He vanished from palace grounds and was never seen again in any royal capacity. His departure was never acknowledged in official records. One insider, who was present that night, would later whisper, "He saw too much, and he said too little too late. What he saw has never been fully revealed." But the speed of his removal spoke volumes. The whispers didn't end there. A housemaid, now long retired, confessed to finding bloodied sheets in the royal nursery early that morning. She claimed they were quietly handed to another maid and swiftly removed from the property just hours before the Queen's sudden and unannounced return to Windsor. There'd been no scheduled visit, no public engagement, no explanation. But she was there by noon, and her face, according to those present, was ashen with rage and something darker regret. In the wake of that night, Anne withdrew into complete silence. Not just quiet, but total refusal to speak. For 2 days, she offered no words to anyone. When she finally did, they weren't words of comfort or explanation. She simply said, "We're not safe here." Meanwhile, Charles attempted something even more drastic. Reports buried in unofficial channels suggest he tried to flee the grounds. Not run away in childish defiance, but escape in fear. A footman found him attempting to unlock the gate to the outer garden. He was crying. When asked where he intended to go, Charles responded, "Anywhere but here." And then, just like that, Miss Harrow was gone. No goodbye, no formal dismissal. Her personal belongings vanished, her room stripped. The staff were told she had left to attend to family matters abroad, but no one ever heard from her again. No records, no sightings. It was as if the woman who had shaped the future monarchs had never existed. Her name, once common in palace circles, became forbidden, uttered only in whispers, replaced by an eerie void in the royal family's collective memory. The Queen's sudden arrival that day, too, remains unaccounted for in official records. But Edward insists it was no coincidence. She returned because she had been told something so serious it couldn't be left to handlers. He believes she arrived not to restore order, but to contain the truth. That Windsor night, he says, marked the moment the family understood that their control had slipped, that some line had been crossed. But the aftermath of that night didn't end with silence. It triggered a royal reshuffle. So dramatic it nearly exposed everything. The palace said it was routine. But insiders now claim the drastic shake-up in royal staff, schedules, and media access that followed the Windsor incident was anything but ordinary. Was it a compassionate response or a coordinated cover-up to protect the monarchy? Within days of that night, palace walls began to shift literally and figuratively. 5 senior aides, some of whom had served the monarchy for over a decade, were suddenly relieved of their duties. No official statements, no graceful transitions. They were simply gone, their names scrubbed from internal rosters, their contributions never acknowledged. Whispers among junior staff described hastily packed offices, confidential files being removed under security escort, and a silence so absolute it felt rehearsed. And at the centre of it all was one unspoken truth. What happened at Windsor could never be repeated or revealed. Charles and Anne were immediately separated. The explanation was logistical convenience, but those close to the family saw something deeper. Charles was sent to a private estate in the north, Anne to a secluded royal cottage in the west. Each had new handlers, ones unconnected to Miss Harrow, unconnected to the previous regime. These handlers weren't just caregivers. They were watchers, monitors. Their job wasn't to raise the royal children, it was to manage them, to contain the aftermath of something the Crown could not afford to revisit. Overnight, a new set of privacy protocols were introduced, ones that limited access to the children, restricted photographs, and restructured how press briefings were handled. Former palace reporters noted the sudden shift in tone, the increase in scripted responses, the lack of spontaneity. It was like they vanished behind a wall, one recalled. They were still visible but never truly seen. And perhaps that was the goal. To control the narrative by minimizing the exposure, to bury the wound beneath layers of ceremonial fabric, One of the most troubling discoveries came years later. A classified psychological assessment of Charles and Anne conducted in the immediate days after Windsor vanished from the Royal Archives. According to Edward, the report contained findings that disturbed even the Queen. But when researchers later tried to locate it, they were told no such file ever existed. Not missing, not sealed, erased. It was as if the palace had wiped away the only documented proof of what those children had endured. Edward later said, "No one was allowed to ask questions, not even Her Majesty," and that statement may be the most haunting of all. Even the physical space was altered. Walls were repainted, rooms renamed, furniture replaced, the corridor where it all happened, reassigned to administrative storage, a symbolic erasure, not just of Miss Harrow but of the entire episode, as if removing the evidence would somehow undo the trauma, as if changing the colours of the walls could silence the screams still trapped between them. But no matter how many layers they painted over the past, Charles and Anne carried the scars, and their choices as adults would mirror their pain in chilling ways. What happens to children? Forced to bury their truth, they rebel, they conform, they implode. In the case of Charles and Anne, their adult lives became silent battlegrounds where the echoes of childhood shaped every move, and the crown watched silently as its future heirs crumbled and clashed. Charles, moulded by obedience and control, grew into a man obsessed with order. His public persona, a composed, articulate prince, masked an inner turmoil he struggled to suppress. Behind closed doors, he exhibited the same rigid behaviours once imposed by Miss Harrow: the need for absolute routine, the intolerance for disobedience, the cold detachment from those who challenged his authority. He ran his household not with warmth, but with structure, every detail managed, every emotion filtered, and when things slipped out of his control, as they often did in private, his reactions were sudden, sharp, and deeply personal. Friends became distant, partners grew confused, his marriage, famously fragile, shattered under the weight of unspoken grief and lingering rage. Anne, meanwhile, took a different path. She did not break down, she shut down. Her refusal to display vulnerability became her shield. The world praised her strength, her stoicism, her relentless commitment to duty. But beneath the surface, Anne was building a fortress, one no one could breach, not even Charles. She rarely spoke about her childhood, even in private. The very mention of the past would harden her tone. When asked once about her upbringing, she replied coldly, "It was structured. That's all it needed to be." But those closest to her knew the truth. Her tireless work ethic, her constant motion, her icy resolve were all ways of outrunning memories too dangerous to face. For Edward, watching them from the periphery was a slow heartbreak. He had been the youngest, the one shielded from the worst but not blind to the fallout. As the years passed, he noticed the growing distance between Charles and Anne. Once inseparable as children, they became estranged in everything but title. At official events, they stood together, but in private, silence stretched between them. The bond had frayed, not from betrayal but from pain neither of them could name aloud. Edward once said, they needed each other more than anyone could imagine. And yet, they couldn't even look at each other without remembering. Then came the letters, hidden in a locked drawer in Charles's private residence, discovered only after one of Edward's aides was given access to old belongings. Dozens of handwritten notes addressed to Anne dated over decades. Some were short, others spilled over multiple pages. In them, Charles apologized for things never spoken, confessed fears he could never say aloud, and begged quietly, heartbreakingly, for a return to the closeness they once shared. None of them had ever been opened, not a single seal broken. Anne had kept them, stored them, but never read them. Her silence had become a statement of its own. And yet, even in that silence, there was tragedy. Two siblings forged in the same fire, scarred by the same hand, yet walking opposite paths through the wreckage. One tried to control the chaos, the other buried it. But neither could truly escape it, and the Crown, the very institution that had once engineered their silence, stood by as both its heirs were consumed by it. But if pain was buried, it didn't stay buried forever, and the final twist uncovered only after Queen Elizabeth's passing would bring everything to light. Tucked inside a sealed envelope, marked only with their childhood nicknames, was the Queen's final message to Charles and Anne. Prince Edward says it was a quiet admission of guilt, sorrow, and warning. For the first time, Her Majesty acknowledged what happened, and why she could never speak of it. The letter wasn't discovered immediately. It took months of sifting through the Queen's most private belongings before a trusted royal archivist stumbled upon the small ivory envelope tucked deep within a locked section of her personal vault. The C.L. bore no official crest, only a single gold-inked symbol, 2 initials intertwined. No one but Charles could access the full contents, but what followed, according to Edward, changed everything. Charles, already fractured by a lifetime of suppressed memory, opened it alone. What he read didn't just vindicate their shared pain, it explained it. Days later, Edward received a call. Charles, emotionally spent and uncharacteristically vulnerable, asked his younger brother to meet him at Sandringham. What followed was not a conversation, but a handoff. Charles placed the letter in Edward's hands, his voice low, trembling. "Read it. Then you'll understand." The pages were stained, not with time, but with feeling. They weren't formal, nor were they regal. They were human, raw, heavy with a burden that had lasted far too long. The Queen, in her final act of truth, admitted the role she played not in causing the darkness, but in allowing it to fester in silence. She wrote of the silence I imposed, a phrase that struck Edward to his core. She spoke of the nights she returned, and sensed the coldness in Anne's stare, the guarded tension in Charles's embrace, and chose stillness over inquiry. She confessed that protecting the institution meant sacrificing comfort, and that the price we all paid was one she never stopped counting. Her words didn't ask for forgiveness, they mourned what could never be repaired. They were not royal, they were motherly and tragic. To Anne, she wrote something coded, but unmistakable: "You were the steel, and I gave you frost." A line that acknowledged both her daughter's strength and the chill she was forced to endure. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but a recognition that Anne had been shaped by the absence of warmth that a mother should have offered. For Charles, her words were even more poignant. "You bore the crown too early, and its thorns broke you." A brutal truth laid bare. She had watched him carry a legacy far too soon, and with it, a pain he was never prepared to bear. When Edward finished reading, he sat in silence. The same silence the monarchy had perfected for generations. But this time, it didn't feel like loyalty, it felt like complicity. And it was then he made his choice. If she could finally say it, he whispered to himself, so could I. Her acknowledgement was not just permission, it was a call, one final chance to speak the truth, not for scandal, but for salvation, for the siblings who had endured it, for the family that had ignored it, and for the legacy that could no longer afford to remain unchallenged. But if Edward's words were meant as closure, they have instead opened a storm, one that now threatens to expose even more than he ever intended. The monarchy thrives on mystique, but what happens when the veil is finally lifted? Prince Edward's revelation has not only shaken the public, it stirred dangerous questions within the institution itself. As the truth spreads, the royal family faces its most uncomfortable reckoning yet. The past is no longer in the shadows. What began as a quiet confession has erupted into a storm. Across the country and beyond, reactions have been fierce and deeply divided. Some see Edward's revelation as an act of courage, a long overdue attempt to bring humanity and honesty to an institution that has too long survived on secrecy. Others view it as betrayal, a breach of the royal code that demands discretion above all else. The public is no longer just watching, they're choosing sides. Sympathy flows toward Charles and Anne, their suffering now reframed in a more tragic light. But so too does scrutiny shift toward those who enforce the silence. For the first time in generations, the people are asking not just what happened, but who allowed it. The palace, true to its nature, offered nothing but a familiar refrain: "We will not comment on family matters." A line designed to maintain dignity, but now hollow in its echo. Silence no longer feels like grace, it feels like complicity. Inside the royal household, the impact is seismic. Sources close to the younger generation say loyalties are beginning to fracture. Some feel Edward's courage must be matched with transparency. Others whisper that he's endangered the very foundation of the crown. Tensions are no longer quiet. They're pulsing beneath the surface, threatening to erupt in ways the monarchy has never faced before. Constitutional experts have stepped into the storm, warning that this revelation, if left unaddressed, could trigger demands for structural reform. The public's tolerance for tradition is not endless, and in an era where truth is expected, the monarchy's refusal to engage may prove more damaging than the secrets themselves. This is no longer just about the past, it's about accountability, it's about legacy, and whether the crown can survive in a world that no longer accepts shadows as protection. Meanwhile, Prince Edward now lives under increased protection, security details expanded, access to him limited. There are real fears both from within and without. Not of violence from the outside world, but of retribution from forces closer to home. A quiet punishment, a slow exile. He knew the risks. And yet he spoke, and in doing so, he's become a symbol of something the monarchy has always feared: an insider who refuses to play by the rules. But as Edward retreats from the spotlight, one final question lingers like smoke in the air. If this truth took 60 years to emerge, what else is still buried? What other stories have been sealed behind palace doors? How many more voices have been silenced in service of the image? Because one truth has been spoken. But in the royal family, one truth often unlocks 1,000 more. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.